Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Tonight, just like always, I'll be reading Reddit story in background while playing Minecraft. I've lived in the suburbs of Columbus, Ohio, for about 12 years now, and for 10 of those years, I would have told you that David Miller was the best neighbor anyone could ask for. He was the kind of guy who'd clear your driveway with his snowblower before you even woke up, and he never missed a chance to wave or offer a polite nod across the fence. But looking back at the silence that used to hang over his house, I realize now that the quiet wasn't peaceful. It was suppressed. My name is Mark, and I'm telling you this because the headlines only covered the what of the tragedy, but they never really captured the how, or the slow, agonizing way a family can rot from the inside out until there's nothing left but a shell. David was a widower, having lost his wife to a sudden illness when their two daughters, Qley and Maya, were still in elementary school. He raised them alone, and from the outside, he was a hero. He worked as a middle manager for a logistics firm, a steady, predictable man who wore iron polos and kept his lawn looking like a golf green. Qley was the eldest, 19 when everything fell apart, and Maya was just 17. They were beautiful girls, polite to a fault, always walking with their heads slightly down when they were around their father. I remember thinking they were just shy, or maybe just deeply respectful of the man who had sacrificed everything to raise them. The first time I noticed a crack in the facade was about 6 months ago. It was a humid July evening, and I was out on my back deck, having a beer and enjoying the late sunset. The Miller's house is situated just slightly uphill from mine, so I have a clear view of their backyard. David was out there, standing by the grill, but he wasn't cooking. He was just standing perfectly still, watching his daughters through the sliding glass door. They were in the kitchen, laughing about something, and Qley was holding her phone up to show Maya a picture. It was a completely normal sibling moment, but the look on David's face wasn't one of a proud father. It was a look of pure, unadulterated suspicion. He looked like a hunter watching prey that was about to bolt. A few days later, I was walking my dog, Buster, past their driveway when I saw Qley sitting on the edge of the porch. She looked like she'd been crying. Her eyes were puffy, and she was fiddling nervously with a silver bracelet on her wrist. When she saw me, she tried to force a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. I asked her if she was doing okay, just being neighborly, and she hesitated for a long second, looking back at the front door as if she expected her father to burst through it at any moment. She told me everything was fine, just some stress with her college applications, but then she leaned in a little closer and asked if I'd seen any strange cars parked on the street lately. I told her I hadn't, and she just nodded, looking relieved but also deeply terrified. I didn't think much of it at the time. Figured it was just typical teenage drama, or maybe David was being a bit overprotective now that his girls were becoming young women. But then the rules started changing. I noticed that the girls were no longer allowed to be in the front yard alone. If they were outside, David was there. If they were coming home from school or work, David was standing in the garage, watching the clock. The atmosphere in our little cul-de-sac started to feel heavy, like the air right before a massive thunderstorm. You could feel the pressure building, even if you couldn't see the clouds yet. The real turning point happened in late September. I was coming home late from a shift at the hospital. I'm a radiologist, so I'm used to seeing things that aren't visible to the naked eye, and I saw a young guy, maybe 20 years old, parked a few houses down from David's. He looked nervous, tapping his fingers on the steering wheel and checking his rearview mirror every 5 seconds. A moment later, Qley slipped out of her side door, running low to the ground like she was dodging gunfire. She hopped into the car, and they sped off as quietly as they could. I remember feeling a sense of dread for her, not because she was doing something wrong, but because I knew David's bedroom window faced that side of the house. The next morning, the screaming started. It wasn't the kind of shouting matches you hear in most households. It was a low, vibrating roar from David followed by the sound of things breaking. I was in my garden, and I could hear him through their open windows. He wasn't calling her names, exactly. He was talking about purity and betrayal, and how she was spitting on her mother's memory. It was chilling because he sounded so calm between the outbursts, like he was delivering a sermon. Maya was crying, begging him to stop, and then the house went dead silent. I stood there with my trowel in my hand, my heart hammering against my ribs, wondering if I should call the police. But then David walked out onto his porch, saw me, and gave that same polite nod he'd given for 10 years. It was the most unsettling thing I'd ever seen. For the next few weeks, the girls were essentially under house arrest. I didn't see Qley go to her classes, and Maya wasn't at the bus stop anymore. David started taking leave from work, claiming he had some family matters to attend to. I'd see him sitting in a lawn chair in his garage, just staring at the street, his face a mask of cold determination. Every time I tried to catch his eye to say something, he'd just stare right through me. It was like the man I'd known for a decade had been replaced by a sentry, a guard at a prison of his own making. I found out later, through the grapevine of neighborhood gossip and eventually the police reports, that David had discovered Qley was seeing that boy, a local college student named Marcus. But it wasn't just Qley. He'd gone through Maya's phone too and found messages from a boy in her grade. In David's twisted, grieving mind, his daughters weren't growing up, they were being corrupted. He saw their desire for independence as a direct attack on the sanctity of the home he had built after his wife died. He had convinced himself that the world outside was a predatory wasteland, and his daughters were becoming part of the rot. One evening, around mid-October, Maya managed to get a note to me. She'd folded it into a tiny square and dropped it over the fence while her father was in the basement. It was frantic, the handwriting shaky and blurred. It said, "He took our phones. He locked the windows. Please, he's not himself. Don't tell him I gave you this." My blood ran cold. I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. I told myself I'd go over there the next morning, under the guise of returning a tool I'd borrowed, and see if I could get the girls out of there or at least talk some sense into David. But tomorrow is a dangerous word when you're dealing with a man who has already crossed the line into madness. That night, I stayed up late, watching the glow of the lights in the Miller house. They stayed on until nearly 3 in the morning. I saw shadows moving behind the curtains, frantic and jerky. I should have called the cops then. I should have trusted my gut. But in a quiet suburb like ours, you always tell yourself you're overreacting. You tell yourself that people are entitled to their privacy, that families have their own ways of handling things. It's a lie we tell ourselves so we can sleep at night, and it's a lie that would haunt me for the rest of my life. The next morning, the sun came up like it was any other day. The birds were chirping, the crisp autumn air was perfect, and for a few minutes, I almost convinced myself that the note was just teenage hyperbole. I went out to get the paper, and I saw David sitting on his front porch. He was dressed in his best suit, the one he wore to funerals. He was sitting perfectly still, his hands folded in his lap, looking out at the street with a serene, almost peaceful expression. He looked at me, smiled a genuine, terrifyingly bright smile, and said, "It's a beautiful morning to start fresh, isn't it, Mark?" I didn't know then that inside that house, the fresh start had already cost 2 lives, and the worst part was, he was waiting for me to find them. The way David looked at me that morning, it's a memory that's burned into my brain with a white-hot intensity. He looked relieved, like a man who had finally finished a grueling, years-long marathon and could finally sit down. I didn't know what to say, so I just mumbled something about the weather and hurried back inside. My hands were shaking so hard I dropped the newspaper on the floor. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the phone, Maya's note crumpled in my pocket. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to call 911, but there was this paralyzing fear of being wrong, of destroying a man's life over a misunderstanding. But then I remembered the suit. Why was he wearing a suit at 7 in the morning? I decided I couldn't wait. I didn't call the police yet. I told myself I'd just go over there and check in. It was the coward's way out, trying to verify the horror before reporting it. I walked across the lawn, the grass heavy with dew, and as I stepped onto his porch, the smell hit me. It wasn't the smell of death, not yet. It was the smell of bleach. Pungent, overpowering, stinging my nostrils. David didn't move as I approached. He just kept staring at the street, that eerie smile fixed on his face. I asked him if the girls were home, my voice cracking more than I wanted it to. He didn't even look at me when he answered. "They're resting, Mark. They're finally safe from all the noise." The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I asked him what he meant by noise, and he finally turned his head to look at me. His eyes were bloodshot, the pupils tiny pinpricks of black. He started talking about the filth on the internet, the way young men look at innocent things, and how he couldn't let his daughters become vessels for sin. He spoke about it so rationally, like he was explaining a math problem. He told me he'd spent the whole night purifying the house. At that point, I didn't care about being polite anymore. I pushed past him toward the front door. He didn't even try to stop me. He just said, "You won't recognize them. They're beautiful again." I stepped into the foyer, and the smell of bleach became deafening, if a smell can be deafening. The house was spotless, unnervingly so. Everything was lined up with mathematical precision. I called out for Qley and Maya, but the only sound was the hum of the refrigerator. I started down the hallway toward the bedrooms, my heart thumping so hard I could feel it in my throat. I reached Qley's door first. It was closed. I hesitated, my hand on the knob, praying to a God I hadn't spoken to in years that I was wrong. I turned the knob and pushed. The room was white. Not just the walls, but everything. David had draped white sheets over every piece of furniture. Qley was lying on her bed, her hands crossed over her chest, dressed in a white lace dress I'd seen her wear to a spring formal once. She looked like she was sleeping, but her skin was the color of marble. There was no blood, no signs of a struggle. It was only when I got closer that I saw the faint, dark bruising around her neck. He'd strangled her. He'd killed his own daughter and then spent hours bathing her, dressing her, and arranging her like a doll. I couldn't breathe. I stumbled back out of the room, retching, and that's when I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. It was David. He was standing in the doorway, watching me with a look of mild disappointment. "I thought you'd understand, Mark," he whispered. "You have a family. You know how hard it is to keep them clean in a world like this." I didn't think. I just ran. I shoved past him, my shoulder catching his chest, and I bolted for the stairs. I needed to find Maya. I knew in my heart it was too late, but the adrenaline wouldn't let me accept it. I burst into Maya's room, and it was the same scene. White sheets, the smell of chemicals, and Maya, little Maya, who had sent me that note, lying there in a matching white dress. He'd done it to both of them. I didn't stay to look at her. I scrambled back down the stairs, falling halfway and bruising my hip, but I didn't feel a thing. I burst out the front door and ran for my house, screaming for someone to call the police. I didn't even realize I was the one who needed to call them until I was inside my own kitchen, fumbling with my phone. When the dispatcher answered, I couldn't even form coherent sentences. I just kept yelling, "The Millers. He killed them. He killed the girls." I looked out my window and saw David still sitting on that porch chair. He hadn't moved. He wasn't trying to run. He was just waiting for the world to come and see his handiwork. Within 10 minutes, the street was a sea of blue and red lights. Officers with their weapons drawn swarmed the Miller property. I watched from my porch, wrapped in a blanket I didn't remember grabbing, as they approached David. He didn't resist. He stood up slowly, held out his wrists, and let them cuff him. As they led him to the patrol car, he looked over at me one last time. He didn't look angry. He looked like he was pitying me, like I was the one who was lost, and he was the one who had finally found the light. The hours that followed were a blur of detectives, forensic teams in white suits, and neighbors standing on their lawns in various states of shock and undress. I had to give a statement, multiple statements. I told them about the note, about this strange car, about the screaming I'd heard weeks before. Every word I spoke felt like a weight being added to my soul. The detective, a tired-looking man named Henderson, kept asking me if I'd noticed any drastic changes in David's behavior. I told him about the lawn, the way he watched the girls, the suit. Henderson just sighed and rubbed his eyes. "It's always the quiet ones," he muttered, a cliche that felt like a slap in the face. As the sun reached its peak, I saw the coroners carrying out the 2 long, black bags. The sight broke something inside me. Those were the girls I'd seen grow up. I'd seen them riding bikes with training wheels, seen them selling Girl Scout cookies, seen them laughing in the driveway just months ago. And now they were leaving their home for the last time in plastic bags because their father couldn't handle the fact that they were becoming their own people. The injustice of it was a physical pain in my chest. I wanted to scream, to hit something, to go to the precinct and demand David tell me why he thought he had the right to decide when their lives ended. But the horror wasn't over. As the police were processing the scene, they found something in the basement that added a whole new layer of depravity to the story. They found a series of journals David had been keeping. They weren't just diaries, they were logs. He had been tracking every single minute of his daughter's lives for the past 3 years. He had recorded what they ate, who they talked to, what websites they visited, even their menstrual cycles. He had installed hidden cameras in their rooms, microphones in their vents. He had been living in a state of total surveillance, convinced that he was protecting them from a corruption that was mostly in his own head. But the most chilling discovery was the plan. The journals revealed that David hadn't snapped. This wasn't a crime of passion or a sudden break from reality. He had been planning this for months. He had written about the day of purification as far back as April. He had bought the white dresses in June. He had even researched the best way to use bleach to cleanse a crime scene without destroying the purity of the bodies. He had been waiting for a reason, a catalyst to justify what he'd already decided to do. And when he found out about Marcus and the other boy, he finally had his excuse. He didn't kill them because they were dating. He killed them because he was finished with them. They had reached an age where he could no longer control every breath they took. And in his mind, if he couldn't own them, no one could. The weeks following the murders were a slow, suffocating crawl. Our neighborhood, once a place of suburban boredom and safety, became a landmark for the macabre. News vans were parked at the entrance of the cul-de-sac for a solid month, and true crime tourists would drive by slowly, pointing their phones at the Miller house as if it were a haunted attraction. I hated all of them. I hated the way they looked at our street like it was a set from a movie, not a place where two vibrant young women had been snuffed out by the person who was supposed to love them most. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Qley in that white dress, or I heard the scratching sound of Maya's note being shoved through the fence. The guilt was a constant, gnawing presence. I'd go over the what-ifs until my brain felt like it was short-circuiting. What if I'd called the police the night I saw Marcus? What if I'd gone over the moment Maya gave me that note? What if I'd just been a better neighbor and noticed the rot sooner? The detectives told me I couldn't have known that David was a master of masking, but that didn't help when I was staring at the empty house next door at 3 a.m. The trial was a circus, but a quiet one. David didn't put up a fight. He sat at the defense table in the same kind of suit he'd worn that morning, looking bored by the whole proceeding. His lawyers tried to go for an insanity plea, talking about unresolved grief and religious delusions, but the prosecution had those journals. They read excerpts from them in court, and the sheer cold-bloodedness of his words silenced the room. He had written about his daughters like they were property, like they were an experiment in perfection that had failed. When they showed the photos of the purified rooms, even the judge had to look away. I had to testify. Standing just a few feet away from David was the hardest thing I've ever done. I felt a wave of pure, concentrated heat radiating off him. Not anger, but a sort of smug satisfaction. When I talked about the note Maya gave me, he actually let out a small, dry chuckle. The bailiff had to warn him to stay silent. I looked him dead in the eye and saw nothing. No regret, no sorrow, not even the peace he'd claimed to have found. He was just a hollow man who had filled his emptiness with a sense of divine authority. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. As they let him out, he looked at the gallery and mouthed the word safe. He still believed he'd done them a favor. After the sentencing, the Miller house was put up for auction. No one wanted it, obviously. It sat there for a year, the lawn growing wild, the for sale sign becoming faded and weathered. Eventually, a developer bought it for pennies on the dollar, tore it down, and built a modern, glass-heavy house that looked nothing like the original. But even with a new structure, the spot feels wrong. The birds don't seem to land in that yard as often as they do in mine. The air still feels a little heavier there. I eventually met Marcus, the boy Qley had been seeing. He came by my house about 6 months after the trial. He was a wreck, his eyes hollowed out by a grief no 20-year-old should ever have to carry. He told me that Qley had been planning to run away that very weekend. She'd saved up a few $100s from a secret part-time job and was going to head to her aunt's house in Chicago. She was so close. She was just days away from being free. He gave me a photo of the 2 of them, one David hadn't found. They were at a park. Qley was laughing, her hair blowing across her face, and she looked so full of life that it hurt to look at. I still live in the same house. People ask me why I don't move, why I'd want to stay next to the site of such a horror. I don't really have a good answer, other than the fact that if I leave, who will remember them? Not the victims in the black bags, but the girls who liked to draw, and the girls who were scared of spiders, and the girls who just wanted to fall in love. I've turned the corner of my garden, the part that faces their old yard, into a small memorial. I planted 2 flowering dogwoods, one for Qley, one for Maya. They bloom in the spring, white and pink, a reminder that beauty can still grow even in soil that was soaked in such darkness. Sometimes, when I'm out there at night, I think about David sitting in his cell. I wonder if he ever sees their faces, if he ever feels the weight of what he took from this world. But then I realize that he's probably still convinced he's the hero of his own story. Men like that don't change because their reality is built on a foundation of their own ego. They don't see the lives they destroy, they only see the control they maintain. The most lingering thought, the one that keeps me up on the anniversaries, is a line from David's journal that the prosecutor didn't read in open court but showed to me during a deposition. It was written on the very last page, dated the night before the murders. It said, "The world will try to tell them they are free, but I am the only one who knows the price of freedom is the loss of the soul. I will keep their souls here, where it is quiet." I look at those two trees every morning while I drink my coffee. They're tall now, their branches reaching toward each other, occasionally touching when the wind blows. I like to think that somewhere, in some version of the world that David couldn't touch, Qley and Maya are finally dating whoever they want, laughing as loud as they can, and living in a house where the windows are never locked and the air is clear of the smell of bleach. But here, in the quiet of the suburbs, I just keep tending to the trees, hoping that one day, the silence next door will finally feel like peace instead of a scream that never ended.